Ethan Brooks thought he was delivering flowers to his own mansion. 30 minutes later, he was standing outside a half-open door, listening to the woman he planned to marry tell a 6-year-old girl she did not belong in the same room as wealthy people. At that moment, something inside him began to break. But to understand why that moment mattered so much, you need to understand who Ethan Brooks really was. Most people knew Ethan as the founder of Brooks Global Logistics, a transportation empire worth more than $3 billion. Business magazines called him a visionary. Financial networks called him one of the smartest entrepreneurs in America. But the people who truly knew Ethan understood something different. They knew he never forgot where he came from. Ethan had grown up in a small Ohio town where money was always tight. His father spent 30 years driving delivery trucks across the Midwest. His mother cleaned houses for wealthy families. Some weeks they barely had enough to cover groceries. Yet despite the hardships, his parents taught him lessons that money could never buy. They taught him respect. They taught him humility. And most importantly, they taught him that a person's character revealed itself in how they treated those who could do nothing for them. Those lessons stayed with Ethan even after success changed his life. While other billionaires traveled with security teams and private entourages, Ethan preferred walking through his own companies unnoticed. Several times a year, he disguised himself as an ordinary employee. Sometimes he worked in warehouses. Sometimes he rode along with truck drivers. Sometimes he delivered packages himself. He called it staying connected to reality. His executives called it crazy. Ethan simply believed that truth looked different from ground level. That October morning felt like any other undercover visit. Wearing a simple delivery uniform and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, he loaded fresh flower arrangements into a white delivery van and drove toward the estate he shared with his fiancée, Victoria Sinclair. The mansion sat on nearly 12 acres outside Manhattan, surrounded by perfectly trimmed hedges and iron gates. Victoria was inside preparing for a charity gala scheduled later that week. To the public, she was admired everywhere she went. She volunteered with children's organizations. She spoke at fundraising events. She always knew exactly what to say and exactly how to say it. Ethan had fallen in love with that kindness, or at least what he believed was kindness. Their wedding was only 2 months away. Invitations had already been mailed. Venues had been booked. Families had made travel arrangements. Everything seemed perfect. As Ethan parked near the service entrance, he felt grateful. For the first time in years, he truly believed he had found someone who loved him for who he was rather than what he owned. Carrying 2 flower boxes toward the side entrance, he noticed movement near the garden pathway. A little girl sat cross-legged beside a flower bed. She could not have been older than 6. Brown curls framed her face as she concentrated on a sketchbook resting on her knees. She was completely absorbed in her drawing, unaware of the world around her. Ethan slowed down without realizing it. The little girl glanced up and smiled. It was the kind of smile that contained no calculation, no expectations, no hidden agenda, just pure friendliness. Before Ethan could say a word, a woman rushed from the service entrance. She wore a housekeeping uniform and looked immediately concerned. "Sophie," she called gently, "you were supposed to stay inside with me." The girl giggled and closed her sketchbook. "I was drawing." The woman shook her head and laughed softly despite her worry. Ethan could see exhaustion in her eyes, but he also saw love. The kind of love that survives long workdays and difficult circumstances. "I am sorry," the woman told Ethan. "She likes to wander when I am busy. She is not bothering anyone," Ethan replied. Sophie looked at him curiously. "Are you a delivery driver?" she asked. Ethan smiled. "Today I am." The little girl nodded seriously as if that answer made perfect sense. Then she hugged her sketchbook against her chest and followed her mother back inside. Ethan watched them disappear through the service entrance. Something about that brief interaction stayed with him. He could not explain why. He picked up the flower boxes and continued toward the mansion, completely unaware that before the afternoon ended, that same little girl would become the reason he questioned everything he believed about the woman he was about to marry. Character is not revealed when people are being watched. Character is revealed in the quiet moments when they believe nobody important is listening. Sometimes the smallest encounter can expose the biggest truth. And what Ethan would discover next would change the course of his entire future. Sometimes the smallest details stay with us for reasons we do not understand until much later. As Ethan carried the flower arrangements through the service entrance, he found himself thinking about the little girl in the garden. He should have forgotten the encounter already. He had meetings to attend, vendors to observe, a charity gala to prepare for. Yet somehow, Sophie Lopez and her sketchbook remained in his thoughts. The mansion buzzed with activity. Event planners moved through hallways carrying decorations. Catering staff coordinated deliveries. Housekeepers prepared guest rooms for visitors arriving later that week. Everything appeared organized and polished. Ethan moved through the property the same way he always did during undercover visits. Quietly, observantly, invisibly. Most people barely glanced at a delivery driver. That was exactly why he liked the role. People revealed themselves when they believed nobody important was watching. After dropping off the final flower arrangements, Ethan stepped outside toward the rear courtyard. There, beneath a large maple tree overlooking the gardens, he spotted Sophie again. This time she was sitting alone on a wooden bench, carefully drawing in her sketchbook. Ethan checked his watch. He still had time before anyone would expect the delivery driver to leave. "Working on something important?" he asked with a smile. Sophie looked up and immediately brightened. "I am drawing my dream house." Ethan sat on the opposite end of the bench. "That sounds pretty important." She nodded seriously. "It has to be big enough." "Big? Enough for what?" Sophie opened the sketchbook and turned it toward him. Ethan expected the drawing of a mansion. Instead, he saw a modest house with flowers in front, a small porch swing, and several stick figures holding hands. "Big enough for everybody," Sophie explained. Ethan studied the picture. One figure was clearly her mother. Another looked like Sophie herself. But one figure stood slightly apart from the others. The figure had no face. No details. Just an outline. "Who was that?" Ethan asked. Sophie looked down at the drawing. "I do not know yet." "You do not know?" She shook her head. "Sometimes I think it is my dad. But Mommy says he is not coming back." Ethan felt a small ache in his chest. "Then who do you think it might be?" Sophie thought carefully before answering. "Maybe somebody who sees us." The answer surprised him. Children usually gave simple responses. That one felt older somehow. Before Ethan could reply, Maria appeared carrying a basket of folded linens. She looked relieved to find Sophie sitting quietly. "There you are," she said gently. "I was worried." Sophie hopped off the bench and ran to her mother. Maria smiled apologetically at Ethan. "Thank you for keeping her company." "She is excellent company," Ethan replied honestly. Maria laughed softly. For the first time, Ethan noticed how tired she looked. Not physically tired. Life tired. Like someone carrying responsibilities that never became lighter. Yet despite it all, warmth still remained in her voice whenever she spoke to her daughter. As Maria turned to leave, Sophie suddenly ran back toward Ethan. She tore a small page from the back of her sketchbook and handed it to him. It was a simple drawing of a delivery truck. Above it, in uneven handwriting, she had written 3 words. "Good people deliver." Ethan smiled. "Thank you." Sophie grinned proudly and hurried after her mother. Ethan folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his pocket. He had received expensive gifts worth millions of dollars over the years. Somehow this small drawing felt more valuable. Watching them walk away, he experienced a strange feeling he could not explain. It was as if that little girl had just handed him a piece of a puzzle he did not yet know he was trying to solve. And before the day ended, the first cracks would begin to appear in the perfect image Ethan had built of the woman he planned to marry. What Ethan noticed about Victoria only minutes later was subtle enough for everyone else to ignore, but once he saw it, he could not unsee it. What Ethan noticed about Victoria only minutes later was subtle enough for everyone else to ignore, but once he saw it, he could not unsee it. He entered the main ballroom carrying an empty delivery cart, blending naturally into the movement of staff preparing for the upcoming charity gala. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, while florists adjusted centerpieces and event coordinators checked schedules. At the center of it all stood Victoria Sinclair. As always, she looked flawless. Her elegant cream-colored dress matched the sophisticated atmosphere around her. Her smile was warm. Her voice was calm. Anyone watching from a distance would have seen exactly why people admired her. Ethan had seen that version of Victoria countless times. But today he was seeing something else. Something smaller. Something hidden between the polished moments. A catering assistant accidentally placed several menu cards on the wrong table. It was not a major mistake. The young woman immediately apologized and moved to correct it. Victoria smiled politely, but Ethan noticed the change in her eyes. The warmth disappeared for just a second. "Please try to pay attention," Victoria said. Her voice remained pleasant enough that nobody would consider it rude. Yet there was something underneath the words. A quiet impatience. The assistant nodded and hurried away looking embarrassed. Ethan continued observing. 20 minutes later, another moment caught his attention. One of the landscaping workers entered through a side door, carrying fresh flower arrangements. The man was older, probably in his late 60s. As he approached, Victoria stepped slightly aside. It was subtle, almost invisible, but Ethan noticed she smiled differently at wealthy donors than she did at employees. With donors, her attention felt genuine. With workers, it felt performed. The difference was tiny, yet once Ethan saw it, he began noticing it everywhere. Around noon, several volunteers arrived to discuss details for the charity event. Victoria greeted them enthusiastically. She remembered names. She asked thoughtful questions. Everyone seemed charmed. Ethan would have been impressed too if he had not spent the last hour watching how differently she interacted with the people serving food, carrying supplies, and cleaning floors. Then something unexpected happened. Sophie appeared again. The little girl walked carefully through the hallway holding her sketchbook against her chest. She was obviously looking for her mother. As she passed near the ballroom entrance, one of the event planners smiled and waved. Sophie smiled back. Several staff members greeted her warmly. It was clear she was well-liked. Ethan found himself smiling too. Then he noticed Victoria watching the interaction. For a brief moment, an expression crossed her face. Not anger. Not exactly annoyance. Something colder. Something closer to disapproval. The look disappeared almost immediately when another guest approached her. But Ethan had seen it. Later that afternoon, he stepped outside to the courtyard and found Maria organizing supply boxes. She looked exhausted but remained focused. "Busy day?" Ethan asked. Maria laughed softly. "They are all busy days." Before Ethan could respond, Sophie came running over holding her sketchbook. "I fixed it," she announced proudly. Ethan looked down. The drawing of the dream house was still there. So was the faceless figure standing near the family. But now Sophie had added something new. A delivery truck parked in the driveway. Ethan chuckled. "Looks like somebody got promoted." Sophie grinned. "Good people should stay." The words hit him harder than they should have. Children often said simple things. Yet somehow Sophie always seemed to say exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment. As Ethan watched the mother and daughter walk away together, he felt a growing unease. Nothing dramatic had happened. No argument. No confrontation. No shocking revelation. Just small moments. Tiny details. Little cracks appearing. In an image he once thought was perfect. And sometimes the most dangerous truths do not arrive with a storm. Sometimes they arrive quietly, one small warning at a time, until the day you can no longer pretend you do not see them. Ethan still believed he knew Victoria Sinclair. But before the afternoon was over, one conversation behind a closed door would prove how wrong he really was. One conversation behind a closed door would prove how wrong Ethan really was. The afternoon sun hung low over the estate as preparations for the charity gala continued. Staff members moved quickly through hallways carrying floral arrangements, folded linens, and event materials. Ethan remained in character, pushing an empty delivery cart toward the rear service corridor. He planned to leave within the next 30 minutes. Instead, a small accident stopped him. As he rounded a corner near one of the private sitting rooms, he heard the sound of a glass tipping over. A second later came the soft gasp of a child. Ethan slowed his pace immediately. The sitting room door was partially open. Inside, Sophie stood frozen beside a side table. A glass of orange juice had spilled across an elegant white tablecloth. The bright liquid slowly spread across the fabric. It was not serious damage. It was not an expensive disaster. It was simply the kind of mistake that children make every day. Maria rushed forward carrying a stack of folded napkins. "I am so sorry," she said as she knelt beside the table. "It was an accident. I will clean it right away." Sophie looked down at her shoes. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her sketchbook. Ethan expected the situation to end there. Then Victoria entered the room. At first, her expression remained calm. "What happened?" she asked. Maria quickly explained the situation. She did not mean to do it. "I should have been watching more closely." Victoria glanced at the stained tablecloth before turning her attention towards Sophie. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The silence itself felt uncomfortable. Finally, Sophie whispered, I am sorry. The little girl's voice was so quiet Ethan almost missed it. Victoria folded her arms. This is exactly why. Children should not be wandering through important event spaces. Maria lowered her head respectfully. It will not happen again. Victoria sighed softly. Then she said something that immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. Certain environments require a different level of preparation. Maria looked confused. I am sorry. Victoria offered a small smile. I am simply saying that children thrive when they grow up around the right influences. Ethan felt a subtle tension settle in his chest. The words sounded reasonable on the surface, but something underneath them felt wrong. Victoria continued. Events like this can be overwhelming. Not every child is comfortable in these settings. Sophie stared at the floor. Maria remained silent. Victoria walked closer to the window before speaking again. Certain opportunities come from certain environments. That is just how the world works. The room became noticeably quieter. Ethan watched Maria carefully. She was trying to remain professional, but discomfort had already appeared in her eyes. Sophie did not fully understand the conversation. Yet children rarely need to understand every word. They understand tone. They understand exclusion. They understand when they are being viewed as less than everyone else. Slowly, Sophie lowered her sketchbook against her side. The bright confidence Ethan had seen earlier began to fade. Victoria did not seem to notice. Or perhaps she did not realize the effect her words were having. Not every child is prepared for rooms like this, she added. Some children simply have a different path ahead of them. The statement was not openly cruel. That was what made it so unsettling. It carried the weight of judgment disguised as wisdom. Maria quietly took Sophie's hand. Come on, sweetheart. Neither of them argued. Neither of them complained. They simply began walking toward the door. As they passed through the hallway, Sophie glanced up briefly. Her eyes met Ethan's for only a second. He recognized that expression immediately. Years earlier, he had seen the same look on his own mother's face after being politely dismissed by people who believed status determined value. It was the look of someone trying not to feel small. Ethan stood motionless as Maria and Sophie disappeared around the corner. Inside the room, Victoria returned her attention to gala preparations as if nothing important had happened. As if a child's confidence had not quietly diminished right in front of her. As if those words carried no consequences at all. And then, just when Ethan hoped he might have misunderstood everything, Victoria said one more thing that would remove any remaining doubt. And then, just when Ethan hoped he might have misunderstood everything, Victoria said one more thing that removed any remaining doubt. Ethan remained hidden in the hallway outside the sitting room. He had no intention of listening further. In fact, part of him wanted to walk away immediately. Yet something kept him standing there. Perhaps it was instinct. Perhaps it was the uncomfortable feeling that the conversation was not over. Inside the room, Victoria watched the doorway where Maria and Sophie had disappeared. The silence lasted only a few seconds. Then she shook her head slightly and began organizing event schedules on a nearby table. One of the event coordinators, who had witnessed part of the exchange, spoke carefully. She seems like a sweet little girl. Victoria paused before responding. I am sure she is. Her voice remained calm and controlled. But the world is not always fair. Ethan felt his attention sharpen immediately. The coordinator offered a polite smile. That may be true, but children usually find their own way. Victoria glanced toward the hallway. Perhaps, but it is better when people understand reality early rather than spend years believing things that are unlikely to happen. The coordinator looked uncomfortable. I'm not sure I understand. Victoria closed the folder she had been reviewing. I am simply saying that expectations matter. Not everyone begins from the same place. Not everyone has access to the same opportunities. On the surface, the statement sounded reasonable, but Ethan recognized what sat beneath it. It was the same belief he had heard moments earlier. The assumption that certain futures belonged only to certain people. The assumption that background determined destiny. The assumption that some doors were never meant to open. The coordinator nodded politely and changed the subject. Victoria returned to her work. Ethan quietly stepped away before anyone noticed him. He walked through the corridor and out into the gardens. The fresh autumn air should have helped clear his thoughts. Instead, it made them louder. He found himself standing beneath the same maple tree where he had first met Sophie. Slowly, he removed the small drawing from his pocket. Good people deliver. 3 simple words written by a child. Yet they carried more wisdom than some adults learned in a lifetime. Ethan stared at the paper for several minutes. He thought about confronting Victoria immediately. He imagined asking her whether she truly believed people were limited by where they started in life. He imagined reminding her that his own mother had once cleaned houses just like Maria. But another voice inside him urged patience. Ethan had spent decades building companies. He knew important decisions required evidence, not emotion. One conversation revealed a great deal. A pattern revealed the truth. So instead of acting, he decided to observe. The rest of the afternoon became an exercise in attention. The more Ethan watched Victoria, the more he noticed subtle differences. Her warmth flowed naturally toward influential guests. Her patience expanded for wealthy donors. Yet around staff members, there was always distance. Always a faint sense of separation. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. But once seen, it could not be unseen. Later that evening, after most preparations had ended, Ethan passed a small employee break area. Inside, Maria was completing paperwork while Sophie colored quietly beside her. The little girl looked different than she had that morning. Not sad. Not upset. Just less certain. Another employee admired one of her drawings and smiled. "That is beautiful." Sophie hesitated before answering. Then she asked a question that broke Ethan's heart. "Do you think it is good enough?" The room fell silent for a moment. Children were not born questioning their value. Someone taught them to do that. Maria immediately leaned closer and wrapped an arm around her daughter. "It is wonderful," she said warmly. "And so are you." Slowly, Sophie's smile returned. Yet Ethan could not forget the hesitation he had heard in her voice. That night, sitting alone in his Manhattan apartment, Ethan placed Sophie's drawing on the kitchen table and stared out at the city skyline. The engagement ring on Victoria's hand represented a future he had spent years building. But for the first time, he wondered whether that future had been built on an illusion. One thing had become clear. He could no longer ignore what he had seen. He could no longer pretend the warning signs were not there. And before making the most important decision of his life, he intended to learn exactly who Victoria Sinclair truly was. What Ethan planned next would give Victoria one final opportunity to reveal her character, and this time she would have absolutely no idea she was being tested. What Ethan planned next would give Victoria one final opportunity to reveal her true character, and this time she would have no idea she was being tested. 3 days later, preparations for the charity gala were nearly complete. The event would bring together business leaders, donors, local officials, and community advocates from across New York. To everyone else, it looked like another elegant evening dedicated to raising money for a worthy cause. Only Ethan knew it would also serve another purpose. Early that morning, he met with an old friend named Daniel Harper. Daniel was a self-made entrepreneur worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but very few people outside the business world recognized him. Ethan trusted him completely. After listening to the entire story, Daniel agreed to help. That evening, Daniel arrived at the estate dressed in simple maintenance clothes. His role was straightforward. He would pose as a temporary facilities worker assigned to assist during the event. If Victoria truly judged people based on status, Ethan believed the difference would become obvious. As guests began arriving, Ethan remained in the background, carefully observing. Victoria was magnificent in front of the crowd. She greeted donors with warmth. She thanked sponsors personally. She spoke passionately about opportunity, education, and compassion. The audience loved her. Several guests even complimented Ethan on choosing such an extraordinary partner. Ethan smiled politely while saying very little. Then Daniel entered the ballroom carrying a supply cart. The first interaction happened sooner than expected. One of the decorative displays near the entrance needed adjustment. Daniel approached respectfully and asked Victoria if she preferred the arrangement moved slightly to improve guest traffic flow. The question was reasonable, professional, helpful. Victoria barely looked at him. "Just handle it," she replied before immediately turning her attention back to a wealthy donor standing nearby. Daniel nodded and walked away. By itself, the moment meant nothing. Ethan continued watching. Over the next hour, similar situations repeated themselves. When prominent guests spoke, Victoria listened carefully. When staff members offered suggestions, her responses became noticeably shorter, colder, more dismissive. Most people never noticed because her words remained polite. But Ethan noticed. Daniel noticed too. The real test came later during dinner service. A minor issue developed when one of the audiovisual systems malfunctioned before a presentation. Daniel quickly stepped forward and identified the problem. Within minutes, he resolved it and prevented an embarrassing interruption. Several staff members thanked him. Victoria simply nodded and moved on without acknowledging his effort. Yet less than 10 minutes later, a donor made a routine comment about supporting the event, and Victoria praised him publicly for his contribution. Ethan felt his doubts shrinking. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Near the end of the evening, Daniel approached Victoria one final time. He politely asked where he should store extra equipment after the event concluded. Victoria glanced at him briefly. Then she said something that immediately caught Ethan's attention. Just leave it where staff normally leave those things. Those things. Not equipment. Not supplies. Those things. A tiny phrase. Easy to overlook. Yet it revealed the same attitude Ethan had heard days earlier. The same quiet separation between people she considered important and people she did not. After the gala ended, Daniel met Ethan privately. You were right, he said. Ethan nodded slowly. He felt no satisfaction. No victory. Only disappointment. He had hoped he was wrong. He had hoped the conversation with Sophie had been an isolated moment. Instead, every observation pointed toward the same conclusion. Victoria's kindness seemed genuine when status was involved. But when she believed someone had no influence, no wealth, and no importance, a different side emerged. Meanwhile, across the estate, Sophie sat beside her mother coloring pictures while waiting for the event to finish. She had no idea that her small encounter days earlier had set all of this into motion. Ethan looked at the drawing she had given him and understood something important. Sometimes children reveal truths adults spend years trying to hide. And as Ethan prepared for the upcoming engagement celebration, he realized that the biggest decision of his life was no longer about marriage. It was about whether he could spend forever with someone whose character had finally been exposed. What happened at the engagement celebration a few days later would leave 200 guests completely speechless. What happened at the engagement celebration a few days later would leave 200 guests completely speechless. The evening arrived wrapped in elegance. Crystal lights reflected across the ballroom ceiling. A string quartet played softly near the grand staircase. Business leaders, philanthropists, family friends, and community figures filled the estate with conversation and laughter. Everyone believed they were attending a celebration of Ethan Brooks and Victoria Sinclair's upcoming marriage. Victoria certainly believed that. She moved through the crowd with confidence, accepting congratulations and smiling for photographs. Several guests commented that she looked radiant. Others spoke about how fortunate Ethan was to have found someone so compassionate and devoted to helping others. Each compliment seemed to strengthen her confidence. From across the room, Ethan watched quietly. He wore a dark suit and carried himself with the calm composure that had helped him build an empire. Yet inside, he felt none of the excitement expected from a man weeks away from marriage. Instead, he felt clarity. The kind of clarity that arrives only after every doubt has been tested and every uncomfortable truth has been confirmed. Near the center of the ballroom stood a small stage prepared for speeches. Most guests assumed Ethan would announce final wedding details. Some expected a charitable initiative connected to the gala. Nobody expected what was about to happen. Shortly after dinner, Ethan stepped onto the stage and tapped the microphone gently. Conversations faded. The room grew quiet. Victoria smiled as she joined him. She slipped her hand into his arm and looked proudly toward the audience. Ethan returned the smile politely before addressing the room. Thank you all for being here tonight. Applause followed. Ethan waited patiently before continuing. I want to tell you a story. Several guests exchanged curious glances. This was not the speech they expected. Ethan continued. A few days ago, I met a 6-year-old girl. The room became even quieter. Victoria's smile weakened slightly. Ethan spoke calmly, never raising his voice. He described a little girl who carried a sketchbook everywhere she went. A little girl who dreamed of a home big enough for everyone she loved. A little girl who believed good people should stay. Many guests smiled warmly at the story. Others listened with growing curiosity. Then Ethan described how that same child accidentally spilled a drink. How she apologized immediately. How she stood quietly while adults discussed her future as if she were not standing there. The atmosphere changed. Guests began paying closer attention. Victoria remained perfectly still beside him. Ethan never mentioned her name. Not once. Instead, he spoke about character, about dignity, about the way people reveal themselves when they believe nobody important is watching. He spoke about his mother cleaning houses to support their family. He spoke about the sacrifices working parents make every day. He spoke about children who deserve encouragement rather than judgment. Every word seemed to carry greater weight than the one before it. Across the room, Ethan noticed Maria standing near the back wall with several staff members. Sophie stood beside her holding the familiar sketchbook. Neither of them understood why Ethan was telling this story, yet both listened carefully. Then Ethan reached into his pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. A few days ago, this little girl gave me a drawing. He held it up. Several guests recognized the image projected onto nearby screens. A simple delivery truck. 3 handwritten words beneath it. Good people deliver. Silence filled the ballroom. Victoria's expression had changed completely now. For the first time all evening, uncertainty appeared in her eyes. Ethan looked directly at the audience. That child reminded me of something important. A person's true character is not measured by how they treat powerful people. It is measured by how they treat those who have nothing to offer in return. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even the musicians had stopped playing. Then Ethan slowly turned toward Victoria. And in that moment, every guest realized this was never going to be an ordinary engagement celebration. The next words Ethan spoke would determine the future of 2 lives and expose a truth nobody in that ballroom was prepared to hear. The next words Ethan spoke would determine the future of 2 lives and expose a truth nobody in that ballroom was prepared to hear. The room remained completely silent as Ethan stood beneath the lights of the stage. Nearly 200 guests watched him. Some looked confused. Others looked concerned. Victoria stood beside him, her confident smile now replaced by uncertainty. For the first time that evening, she seemed unsure of what was coming next. Ethan took a slow breath. Everything I have said tonight comes down to one simple belief, he began. A person's worth is not determined by their job title, their income, their background, or the family they were born into. Several guests nodded quietly. Ethan continued. My mother cleaned houses for wealthy families. My father spent decades driving delivery trucks. The values they taught me built every success I have today. The room remained focused on every word. Because of them, I learned something very important. Character is revealed by how we treat people who cannot improve our status, increase our wealth, or advance our careers. Victoria lowered her eyes. Ethan never raised his voice. He never attacked her personally. That made the moment even more powerful. Over the past several days, I have listened carefully. I have observed carefully. And I have come to realize that the future I thought I was building is not the future I can honestly choose. A soft murmur moved through the audience. Victoria finally stepped toward him. Ethan, please. Her voice trembled slightly. We can discuss this privately. Ethan looked at her with genuine sadness rather than anger. I considered that. He paused. But marriage is built on values. And when values no longer align, silence becomes dishonesty. The room fell quiet again. Ethan slowly reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small velvet ring box. Several guests inhaled sharply. Victoria stared at it without moving. Ethan opened the box and carefully removed the engagement ring. Then, instead of dramatic gestures, he simply placed it gently on the table beside him. I can forgive mistakes, he said. I can forgive poor judgment. I can forgive words spoken during difficult moments. His voice remained calm. But I cannot build a life with someone who measures human value by social position. Tears formed in Victoria's eyes. For a moment, she looked less like the confident social figure everyone admired and more like a person facing a painful truth. Ethan continued softly. I do not believe you are an evil person. I believe you have spent too much time judging people before truly knowing them. Those words hit harder than any public accusation could have. Victoria looked down. For the first time, she had no defense ready. No carefully crafted response. Only silence. Ethan stepped away from the microphone. The engagement was over. Yet something unexpected happened during the weeks that followed. There were no public scandals. No interviews. No humiliating headlines. Ethan refused to attack Victoria publicly. He simply moved forward. 1 month later, Maria received an envelope at her apartment. Inside was a handwritten letter. It came from Victoria. The letter was brief. She admitted that she had been wrong. She admitted that she had made assumptions about people she never took the time to understand. Most surprisingly, she apologized directly to Sophie. One sentence stood out above all the others. "Your daughter taught me something I should have learned long ago." Maria read the letter twice before placing it carefully in a drawer. She did not contact Victoria. She did not seek revenge either. She simply accepted the apology and continued focusing on her future. Meanwhile, Ethan focused on something larger than disappointment. He focused on creating opportunities. Months passed. Maria entered Brooks Global Logistics through a leadership development program. She was not suddenly promoted into a major executive role. Instead, she worked hard, learned new skills, and gradually earned a position as an operations supervisor. The role came with responsibility, challenges, and a chance to build a better future for herself and Sophie. For the first time in years, she was no longer living day to day. She was building something lasting. And as Ethan watched those changes unfold, he realized that sometimes the greatest victories do not come from exposing someone's flaws. They come from helping someone else discover their potential. 6 months later, a little girl with a sketchbook would walk onto a stage and hand Ethan a drawing that would bring the entire story to a perfect ending. 6 months later, a little girl with a sketchbook would walk onto a stage and bring the entire story full circle. The morning of the launch arrived beneath a bright Ohio sky. Unlike the elegant galas and high-profile charity events Ethan had attended throughout his career, this gathering felt different from the moment he arrived. There were no luxury cars lining the entrance, no celebrity guests, no reporters competing for attention. Instead, the room was filled with working families, teachers, community leaders, childcare providers, and employees whose lives had been shaped by opportunity rather than privilege. Above the stage hung a simple sign: the Sophie Foundation. As Ethan stepped to the microphone, applause filled the room. Looking across the audience, he felt something he had not experienced in a long time. Peace. Not the peace that comes from success. Not the peace that comes from wealth. The peace that comes from knowing your actions align with your values. In the front row sat Maria. 6 months earlier, she had worried constantly about making ends meet while raising Sophie alone. Now she served as an operations supervisor within Brooks Global Logistics. She was still learning, still growing, still facing challenges every day. But for the first time in years, she was building a future rather than simply surviving the present. Beside her sat Sophie, now 7 years old, swinging her feet happily beneath her chair and holding a large drawing folder on her lap. Ethan smiled when he saw her. Throughout his speech, he spoke about dignity. He spoke about opportunity. He spoke about the thousands of hard-working people whose contributions often went unnoticed. Then he shared a lesson he wished more people understood. The strongest communities are built when people stop asking who belongs and start asking how they can help others belong. The audience responded with warm applause. After the ceremony ended, families explored scholarship programs, educational resources, and childcare initiatives funded through the foundation. Children laughed. Parents exchanged hopeful conversations. Everywhere Ethan looked, he saw people who felt welcomed, people who felt seen. Eventually, Sophie approached him carrying a folded drawing. Her eyes sparkled with excitement. "I finished it," she announced proudly. Ethan smiled. "Finished what?" Sophie handed him the paper. "The house." Curious, Ethan knelt beside her and slowly unfolded the drawing. Instantly, he recognized it. The same house she had been drawing since the day they first met. The same porch swing. The same flowers. The same family standing together outside. But one detail had finally changed. The faceless figure was no longer faceless. The figure now had eyes. A smile. Familiar features. It was Ethan. Beneath the drawing, Sophie had written 5 simple words. "The man who saw me." Ethan stared at the page. For a moment, he could not speak. Out of every contract he had signed, every award he had received, and every accomplishment he had achieved, nothing had ever touched him quite like those words. Then he noticed something else. The figure was no longer standing apart from the family. It stood beside them, part of the picture, part of the story. Ethan looked at Sophie and smiled. "Can I ask you something?" Sophie nodded. "Of course." Ethan pointed to the drawing. "Why did you finally give him a face?" Sophie looked at the picture as if the answer were obvious. "Because now I know who it is." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "And who is it?" Sophie smiled. Then she gave the answer that would stay with him for the rest of his life. It is the person who never looked away. For a moment, neither Ethan nor Maria could speak. Tears filled Maria's eyes. Sophie simply smiled, unaware of how deeply her words affected them. To her, she was only telling the truth. Ethan carefully folded the drawing and held it against his heart. Looking around the room, he saw children laughing together, parents speaking with confidence, families feeling welcome regardless of their background, nobody worrying about status, nobody wondering whether they belonged. Because for once, everyone belonged. Years later, thousands of families would benefit from the Sophie Foundation. Countless children would receive opportunities that changed their futures. But Ethan would always remember the lesson that started it all. Character matters more than image. Kindness matters more than status. And the smallest acts of compassion often create the largest ripples of change. Sometimes the people who change our lives arrive carrying nothing more than a sketchbook. Sometimes the greatest teachers are the ones we are least likely to notice. And sometimes all it takes to change a life is the simple decision to truly see another human being. This story reminds us that true character is shown in how we treat those with less power, especially children. Kindness, humility, and respect leave lasting positive impacts, while careless words can cause deep harm. As the author, I believe compassion is a true measure of success. This story is intended for educational and inspirational purposes, encouraging viewers to reflect on their values, practice empathy, and build stronger, more meaningful relationships. Declaration: this story contains some creative elements and the use of AI technology, with the purpose of providing engaging entertainment while sharing meaningful, inspiring, and educational life lessons with viewers. Disclaimer: the content presented in this video is intended for educational, inspirational, and entertainment purposes only. Viewers are encouraged to reflect on the themes and lessons discussed and apply them according to their own judgment, experiences, and circumstances.